thoughts around the sermon title, Korban. It can also be spelled with a C. But the Hebrew word is Korban, and in singular, and it's korbanot when it's more than one, and it's plural. I'll get back to that later in my few thoughts. There is a story about a rabbi that was visiting a congregation, the temple. And as they got to a certain prayer in the service, I think the Shema, some of the menfolk stood up for the prayer and others sat down. And the ones that were sitting were yelling to the others to sit down, and the ones that were standing were yelling to the others, stand up. And he just tried to get to the amen as soon as possible, not really knowing what to do. And then he thought, as a service to this troubled temple, he will try and establish what is the tradition. How do these people pray in this temple, this specific prayer? So he went to the oldest living member of the temple, which was 99 years old, a homebound person that wasn't there for the service. And he said, Shimon, tell me, what is the tradition in the temple? Do you sit for the prayer? He said, no, that is not the tradition. He said, Simon, is the tradition to stand for the prayer? He said, no, that is not the tradition. He said, but those that were sitting were yelling to the others to sit down and the other way around. He said, that is the tradition. Tradition, a beautiful thing. Jesus laid into tradition and the way that it was always done and the ways of the elders in this passage rather mercilessly. In an interesting conversation, he demonstrated his skill as a teacher of wisdom. Very much in the Socratic way, where he would ask questions of them. And in the end, we often see, as it is recounted in the Gospels, that they had to be quiet and walk away, because while they were trying to lead him into a trap, it was often the other way around, that he ensnared them with their own arguments. What we see here is the attack on Jesus as somebody that was trying to give his own interpretation and version of the Jewish tradition and the teachings of the Scripture. It is also an attempt by the author of the Gospel to indicate Jesus was really the Messiah. He was from God, and trying to give him legitimacy. Said, this is what Jesus did. He was arguing with the established figures of authority, and he was quoting Scripture to say, this is legitimate. My view is legitimate. Look at the Scriptures. Look at what your own Scriptures say. Look at what our Scripture says. Here it is. And he was laying into them about the law of compassion, the law of love, where they were talking about taking one law and using it to avoid doing the law of love. They would avoid taking care of their parents, he said, by saying, no, this is Korban. And what does Korban mean? It is simply a word that in the general sense means an offering, which is dedicated to God... So he said what you would do is you would take any of your possessions and say, no, I put this aside as an offering in the temple to God, or an offering to the temple treasure, like our stewardship drives. You say, all right, we have that, I'll pay my temple tax with this, so I can't use this money to take care of my parents. And by implication, Jesus was saying, no, you're also not taking care of your parents, you're just using this law to avoid doing the law of love. When I read this passage, I think Jesus was rather harsh to them. It makes me think of the guy who got stuck on the road and late at night, probably in the snow, walking to a light that he saw in the distance. And as he was walking, he was arguing with himself, constructing the future events, saying, I will knock on the door and this guy won't respond at first. And then I'll continue knocking and eventually he'll come out and say, what do you want? And he said, well, I got stuck on the road and this thing, that. When eventually the guy will chase me away and say, I'm not here to lend you assistance. Call 911 or call AAA. And as he was walking, arguing with himself, eventually when he got to the door and he knocked, and this guy opened very friendly and said, I don't want your pump or your assistance, you can go to hell. That was his response. In a sense, this was what I think Jesus was doing almost to these people. They were asking a simple question, and he gave them both barrels, full blast. Don't be like this. Don't avoid the basic law of compassion. Don't invoke your tradition to avoid doing what the greatest commandment tells you to do, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, not even to mention your parents. The church has many beautiful traditions, and the longer the church is in existence, a specific church or a denomination, the more traditions there are. And in a sense, I regretted that I wasn't raised in the Catholic tradition, because there is so much, especially during a rich time like Lent, where everything that happens and small things that I'm not aware of, that is in a service or in a building or in a note or in a writing, that I don't know the meaning of until somebody that is more properly educated in the tradition can tell me this is what it means. Any human group, any society, any meeting, any association, any town, city, and nation develop traditions, ways of doing certain things. And those are normally things that are important to repeat doing, things that mean something to them, things that make life better, enhances life, or bring a richness to life, so that people say, we should do this again. This is important enough for us to repeat. And then a custom starts, which later becomes a tradition the longer you do these things in a specific way. Unfortunately, what happens with us as humans, as generations come and go, is that so often we forgot what the tradition or the custom was about, why we started doing that specific thing. We just accept the tradition and we carry on. This is the way we do things. And often, we do it because of tradition, not because of the original meaning. I spent yesterday in a meeting the whole day in Framingham at the conference office. And as the three conferences of Southern New England are merging in these days, over the next 3 years it will be phased in. there is a lot of talk about how this should happen. Which board should do what, when. It's an extremely complicated process because, as with any entity, there is some money involved. So the Connecticut Conference has got their trust funds and their monies, Massachusetts, and then also Rhode Island. So when there's money involved, you always have to say, all right, how are we going to handle this? And I said to them, and it wasn't much appreciated at 2 board meetings back, I said, we're dealing with the easy stuff now, this process. I said the heavy lifting will start once we start talking about the money. And we're moving into that phase now. It's going remarkably well, I must say. One of the people at that meeting was Don Remick, and he preached there, I think, 3 Sundays ago. And I think very effectively illustrated some of the context of the church, the broader church that we exist in today, where he had the depressing statistics of 3 churches in the USA every week close their doors. 1 church in the United Church of Christ that we are part of closed doors every week. And so forth, and so forth. And some people were rather depressed after that. I don't want to say there's no need to be depressed, but I also think there is hope. And yesterday at the meeting, I think it was Jim Mantell, our outgoing conference minister, said he's facing a lot of pressure from other conference ministers, where things are not going as well as in the Massachusetts conference. And he said he had to say to them a few years ago, we cannot continue to maintain and spend money on that which is imploding and which has become dysfunctional. And he said he's not popular because he had to say that. But that is unfortunately the reality not only of organizations and of churches, but of all life. When something no longer has a function in the evolutionary process, it disappears. There is no longer a need for it. And therefore, as Don Remick said in his follow-up, and I want to encourage you to read on our website all the material that he sent to us, that he placed there. The important question in all of this, looking at church, looking at the future of the church, looking at the reality that we find ourselves in, the important question is not so much how, but it is why. Why are we doing what we are doing? And that, I want to ask you, we should apply to everything. Why are we collecting the offering the way that we do? Why do we have a certain liturgy, a way of doing things? Why do we light the candles? Why do we have prayer? Why do we have a sermon? Why do we have this form of a service? Why do we have this very expensive seating in this beautiful historic building that we as congregation use once a week if there isn't a blizzard? And I'm not trying to be mischievous or controversial. I'm trying, in a sense, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus to say, let us ask ourselves, why are we involved? Why are you here today? Why do we go to coffee hour? Why do we meet and have all our meetings and boards and committees? The good news is what I've observed and experienced over the past 4 years in this church with you people is that you are able to absorb a very significant amount of change in a very short time period. Realizing that we have a window of opportunity like the conference to make our decisions before we run into trouble and other people will be making the decisions about our future for us. I was constantly pushing the change that I thought was necessary to secure a long-term future for the church. And sometimes I was running ahead, going too fast. And I've got the scars to show for that, and that is fine. It is all good. And sometimes you were moving ahead of me, but somehow we managed to stay together. We have a different order of worship. The choir has new robes. They're recessing now. It took us a while to figure out when they should walk down and how and so forth, but people stuck with us in that. All our boards meet on one evening now, or have been for about 2 years now. And an important next step, we are looking at the Emerson Fields. You probably all received that letter during the week. You say, all right, the council and the board of trustees appointed a committee to look into the Emerson Field. How can we best make use of that asset? And we'll have our first meeting with engineering firms today, after the service. It is good to experience that this group of people are willing to consider the future and say, even though there are certain things that we love, be it facilities, be it assets, be it customs, be it tradition, that we are willing in the interest of the long-term future of the church for those that will come after us to consider what we should change and what not, so that we can continue to be a presence of God here on the town green, more so in the community and in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so that we can continue through our Board of Missions to have a healing presence in the world. Because the why question that we should constantly ask and apply to everything is this an expression of the love of God? Is that present in our service? Is that present in our meetings? Is it present in the very fabric of the church? And if a custom and a rule and a bylaw or any aspect of the service no longer represents that for us, we should talk about it. Whether we should change it or whether we should be changed, so that we can arrive at a point where we understand what it signifies and what it is a symbol of and what it should express to us. There is another meeting assigned to Korban, that which you set aside for God. And that developed later on in the Jewish tradition, in the rabbinic tradition, where it means something that you give up for God, that you let go of for God. And let us in the season of Lent, where it is tradition in the church to give something up, let us give up that which does not survive the question, does this express the love of God? Is this an expression of compassion, as Jesus taught us? Is this an expression of God's justice and God's love? Let us do that. And continue as church to walk in the example of whom? The one who he says that we are disciples of. That the one that walked with courage, but with great compassion for that which is important, and especially that which brings life to people, that brings healing and wholeness to the world. May we be people fully of Korban, dedicated to God, and let us walk into that bright future that is ahead for us. Let us embrace that, or otherwise we will be sad witnesses of the work of God passing us by and finding expression in other structures and groups that will be doing God's work. Let us embrace one another also in this process, and continue the process in May, when we will ask the question and try and respond in love to it. What is our purpose? What is our mission? What should we as church be doing? Let us celebrate the opportunity and make the best use of this critical time where we find ourselves and where God is calling us again to do God's work. Amen.